Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. As a young university student, I picked up a red cloth-bound novel with mildew-spotted pages and read about the adventures of an English aristocrat who called himself the Scarlet Pimpernel. Outwitting the newly installed revolutionary leaders, the Scarlet Pimpernel smuggled aristocrats condemned to die at the hands of Madame Guillotine out of bloody France to the safety of Mother England. For years I was enchanted by the adventures of the Scarlet Pimpernel as told by the Baroness Aussie, and to this day remember the ditty which immortalised the fearless leader. We seek him here, we seek him there, those Frenchies seek him everywhere. Is he in heaven? Is he in hell, that demmed, elusive Pimpernel? Baroness Autsie's books transported me to the reign of terror of post-revolutionary France and the river of blood flowing through the streets of Paris as hundreds of French aristocrats are sent to the guillotine. I've rarely met another Scarlet Pimpernel fan, but when I heard about my next guest's new book, I knew I'd found a kindred spirit. Kate Forsyth is one of Australia's favourite novelists, with over 40 novels to her name and over 1 million books sold worldwide, as well as the swag of writing awards to her credit. Kate is a literary force to be reckoned with. Her latest novel, The Blue Rose, is set against the dual backdrops of revolutionary France and Imperial China and tells a gloriously rich, moving tale of enduring love, of cultural differences and heeding lessons from our past. I'm thrilled to welcome Kate to the podcast today. Hi, Kate.
Hello, thank you for having me.
This book was a joy to read, and not only because I'm deeply interested by that terrifying period in French history, but also because I found your female protagonist, Viviane, to be such a compelling character. I was wondering if you could tell me a bit about how you came to write about Viviane and her journey.
Well, it all began for me with the Scarlet Pimpernel as well, because I read that when I was a teenager. I guess I would have been 14 or 15, and I absolutely loved it. And it sparked in me a lifelong fascination with the French Revolution. I always said I was going to write a book set during that bloody and tumultuous time. But the idea never really came to me until about 2 years ago. And I was pursuing another interest of mine, which is the history of the rose. And I read this account of how the first red rose in Europe was actually brought from China in 1792. And this sparked this idea for me because I thought, well, really, did red roses really come from China in 1792? And that's right at the beginning of the French Revolution. How fascinating. And so I began to read and research just out of interest. And the more I read about it, the more sure I was that I was going to be able to create a story around this kind of mystery of this incredibly beautiful red rose. The character of Viviane grew out of what I was trying to do. One of the things that I was adamant about was that I wanted to show all sides of the story with the French Revolution. I didn't want to have all the revolutionaries being bad and all the aristocrats being, fine and noble. And I didn't want all the aristocrats being, the villain and all the revolutionaries being wonderful, because that just simply wasn't the way that it was. And so Viviane was my focal point of trying to show how, the French Revolution change lives and kind of galvanise society, and particularly feminist rights.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, I understand that the other protagonist, David Stronach, was inspired by a real-life person. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So my very first idea, for the Blue Rose was that I wanted to have an aristocratic young woman falling in love with a commoner. And, for their love to be impossible in the world in which they lived. So I always knew that, my heroine was going to be, the daughter of a French marquis and live in a chateau. And I always knew that my romantic hero was going to be a gardener, because I was drawing upon this kind of old Chinese fairy tale called The Blue Rose. You know, the way that stories grow, it's always kind of strange and magical. I've been thinking about the story in the back of my mind for quite some time, and Vivian was quite well developed in my imagination. This is very early on in the process. But my gardener, I knew very little about him. I was actually in Wales at a storytelling festival, and after the festival was over, I drove through the beautiful rolling, hills and mountains of Wales to meet a friend at Tintern Abbey. I'd never been to Tintern Abbey, and so she, drove down to meet me, and I drove up to meet her. Along the way, I was, driving through all these little Welsh villages, and they all have the most incomprehensible names. I cannot spell them, and I cannot pronounce them. But then I drove through this beautiful, tiny little Welsh village right on the shore of this, kind of fast-moving river with a big mill, and it was called Fleur de Lis. So I stopped my car and filled it up with petrol, and I asked the man at the petrol station, I said, "Why is your village called Fleur de Lis instead of something kind of Welsh and incomprehensible?" And he told me that the village had been founded by this group of refugees from France who had fled persecution, religious persecution, under the French king, and had come to Wales because Wales was another Protestant city, country. It was a Methodist country, and the French who fled France were Protestants, Huguenots. And so they had come to Wales looking for somewhere safe to live, and they'd settled on the bank of this river so they could use it to turn their mills. They made linen from flax. And so they had called the village after their homeland. Fleur de Lis is a national emblem of France. And I was so enchanted by this story that I immediately decided that I was going to make my gardener Welsh. So that he could, because I needed him to speak French, and I needed him to speak French quite fluently so that he could go to France and work at the chateau. And so I just decided to make him Welsh, and my favourite Welsh name is David, Duffet. And so I called him David. Now, quite a long time later, like almost exactly a year later, I'm reading all the memoirs and accounts of the first British embassy to China, which left in 1792 and came back in 1794. And 2 gardeners were employed by this embassy to collect flowers and plants from China on behalf of Sir Joseph Banks at Kew Gardens. And one of the 2 gardeners was called David. Now, it was just such a coincidence. I had called him David Griffiths in my notebook. I just made up a Welsh name for him, which I liked. And I researched the real life David and found out very little about him. So I thought, well, I'll just take his name and give it to my gardener who I wanted to travel on this embassy. And that is how David Stronach came to be David Stronach.
Now, the details that you've managed to weave into Vivian's story are astonishing, most of which are based on actual historical events. So how much research did you have to do for this book?
I knew a lot about the French Revolution anyway, because, my reading of The Scarlet Pimpernel and A Tale of Two Cities when I was a teenager had sparked this interest, and so I was always reading books about the French Revolution. And I had studied it at school. But, of course, I had to go back and study it all again and work out my timelines and work out how to weave Vivian's imaginary story in with the true events of the French Revolution. What to leave in and what to leave out is always a challenge. And I knew nothing about China, absolutely nothing about Imperial China. I'd never been there. I'd always been kind of interested in it and, so I had a few books about it. But I had to do an enormous amount of research into the the culture and history of China at that time. And I also had to do an enormous amount of research into the history of gardening, both in the West and in the East. I am a passionate gardener, and I've always been interested in gardens. And so again, I had done a lot of reading previously, but I really had to understand the philosophy behind 18th century European gardening and 18th century Chinese gardening, because they had very, very different beliefs about why and how gardens would be planted. So the research was enormous, but it's so fascinating. I loved every minute of it.
I think a lot of people might be surprised to know how much effort and time goes into researching a book like this.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I think there's a great relationship of trust between the writer and the reader. And if I betray that trust, then the reader feels betrayed. And quite often, if a writer's let you down with sloppy research or obvious mistakes, or by deliberately altering the known historical fact in order to make their story more exciting, well, quite often the reader will never read them again. I like to presume that I have highly intelligent and sophisticated readers who are as eager to learn, as they are to be entertained. And it's my job to make sure that by the end of my book, they know a great deal that they didn't know before. It's also my job to make sure that the learning is effortless and enjoyable. I have to make sure that every single step of the story makes sense, and they don't need to have prior knowledge to understand that story. But they also need to make sure that that the narrative is never weighed down with explanation or with fact, because this is a novel. It is not a historical textbook.
So I wanted to ask you, is the Chateau of Bellissima-sur-Lac based on a real place or a product of your imagination?
Both. So when I was first researching and writing, when I was doing the early research for the Blue Rose and, building my plan, I had imagined that I would have the chateau in the Loire Valley. I'd been there before. It's absolutely beautiful. The chateaus are amazing. And so I went to the Loire Valley, but it didn't quite work for me, both geographically and historically. I wanted something that was much more remote from Versailles, because I needed Viviane to be very isolated and lonely, and I needed the journey to and from France to be difficult. And the other thing I wanted is I wanted there to be some kind of clear engagement with the revolution, with the place of my setting. And the very first act of rebellion against the king happened in Brittany. And so that drew my attention to it. So I went to Brittany, which I'd never been to before, and I was absolutely enchanted, both by the landscape, but also by its mythology, its folklore. Brittany is a Celtic country, and all the old stories and myths are still very, very present in the landscape, and I loved that. Particularly the Arthurian myths. So when I was in Brittany, I visited a place called the Pont Forest, and it has two chateaux there. One is an old medieval chateau on an island in the middle of a lake. It was almost exactly how I imagined Viviane's chateau. It's called the Chateau at Trestesson, and if you Google it, you can see pictures of it. I've actually got them on my website, and it has so many amazing old tales associated with it. The other one is on the other side of the forest, and it's meant to be a castle conjured by the wizard Merlin for his much younger apprentice, Viviane, the Lady of the Lake. And the whole forest is rich in Arthurian folklore, And I was very interested in drawing upon that. So I drew upon these two chateaux and made them into one, which is built out of my imagination.
One of the things I found equally fascinating and terrifying in your book, Kate, was the bloodthirsty nature of the people who bade for the execution of the aristocracy. You've depicted scenes of women knitting under the shadow of the guillotine and of revelling in the blood and gore splattering them as heads roll, people cheering and clapping each successful execution. It seems such an inhumane thing to do, but the history books are filled with such accounts, aren't they?
Yes, that's exactly right. And I mean, it's not impossible. It's very difficult for us living in this peaceful, democratic society to imagine what would drive you to such rage, to such anger, to such a thirst for revenge. And this is where, history is so important, because if we can understand our past, it helps us, I think, appreciate how much we have learned, but also understand how much more we still have to learn in our society. The French political system was immobile. It was locked into place. It seemed impossible that it could ever be changed. Elsewhere in the world, many societies were moving towards a more democratic system. Many societies were discarding old, totalitarian regimes. But France had been that way for 1,000 years, and it seemed impossible that it could ever change. For the revolutionaries, it began wanting to effect change without blood, but it proved to be so difficult. And then once the kind of wheels of the revolution started, it was seized upon by, true radicals who wanted to kind of wash France free of all tyranny through blood. And that, of course, it led to dreadful scenes. But many of the people in France hated that kind of aspect of the revolution and were very, very glad when it was over. Unfortunately, a bloody revolution changes things fast, while a revolution that is done through law and through changes to political systems is very, very slow and sometimes it's impossible. It's a really interesting aspect of history, I think.
It certainly is. Now, Viviane's point of view is such a fascinating one, isn't it? She's very much caught between two worlds. She comes from an ancient, noble family. Blue blood runs through her veins, but her father is exceptionally cruel to her. She's as much a prisoner of her class as the commoners are, yet she's hated equally and faces the same fate despite her powerlessness. I thought this was a really interesting statement about the powerlessness of women in general at the time. They were possessions with few rights and yet were sent to the guillotine with as much abandon as the men that controlled them. Was this something you wanted to address specifically?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I think is really important to understand about the French Revolution is that it was a chance for women to have their voice heard for the first time. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is a famous document which was composed and written by the early revolutionaries when they were trying to effect constitutional change in France. And it inspired a passionate document written by a young woman whose name was Olympe de Gouges. And she called hers a Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Citizen, where she called out to women saying, it's time to rise up, make your voices heard. The tocsin of reason is sounding out across the world. Rise up, speak out. Let's fight for our rights as well. She was a poet and a playwright, and her works were quite radical. She ended up on the guillotine, dying on the guillotine because of her radical feminist beliefs. But her work then inspired Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote a vindication of a Declaration of the Rights of Women. And through Mary Wollstonecraft, we began to have active stirrings of, change. In both England and France at that time, women had no legal rights. They had no political body. They were considered an appendage of their husbands and or their fathers. And so they were not permitted to own property. They were not permitted to vote. They were not permitted to go to university. They were not permitted to work as lawyers or doctors or a whole host of different tasks. They had no rights over their own bodies of any kind. They could be bought and sold just like a cow or a pig, and were often done. That was often what happened to them. If they fought back, or if they by chance killed their abusive husband, they were charged with petty treason, which carried with it a death sentence. So the French Revolution, as cataclysmic as it was, it did actually begin to open up cracks for women to try and fight for their rights. The Women's March on Versailles is the first mass uprising of women in the entire history of the world. Thousands of women armed themselves with whatever they could lay their hands on, rolling pins and broomsticks, kitchen knives. And they marched from Paris to Versailles, a march that took more than a day. They marched in pouring rain, barefoot and ragged, and then they protested outside the palace, begging the king for bread so they could feed their hungry children. They ended up invading the palace, taking the king and queen prisoner, and taking them back with them to Paris. And this event was the thing that really got the machinery of the revolution starting. Now, nowadays, we see women getting together and marching against tyranny, marching against unfair laws about, women's education, women's rights over their own body, women's right to be paid equally for labour as men are. And without the Women's March on Versailles, we would not have the freedoms that we have fought so hard to win.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me that you highlight the plight of Chinese women at this time as well. David witnesses firsthand the horrific practice of feet binding and the manner in which the women are conditioned to accept this as their fate. I think this is just another example of ways in which patriarchal societies choose to control women. And it's interesting to me that despite the lessons of history, we still seem to be having the same kind of debates today, don't we?
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That was a large part of my motivation in writing this book and in writing it in the way that I did. I would have loved to have been able to have gone inside Chinese culture and shown a little bit more of it, but I was very much prescribed by the truth of the historical record. The embassy that travelled from Britain to China in the 1790s was entirely composed of men, as was usual at that time. And once they were in China, they were never permitted to go inside a Chinese house and meet Chinese women, have any engagement with them. It was utterly forbidden, both by the ambassador, Lord Macartney, and also, of course, by the fact that it was an integral part of Chinese culture at that time that women were kept separate and hidden and bound to the house, both literally and metaphorically. So in the historical record, there were only a few encounters. The British, when they first arrived in China, went to inspect a peasant's house and saw the spinning wheel by the fire still spinning, but the women of the house had fled as fast as they could because they could not be seen by the Westerners. Then there was their first sight of a woman and a child with bound feet, which shocked them all terribly, and they all wrote about it in their memoirs and letters. The horror of seeing these women who had been deliberately hobbled and were unable to walk without assistance. Then they saw that the Manchurian women had not had their feet bound and were able and were walking about and riding freely, and saw the contrast between these two cultures within China. And then finally, in their final weeks in China, some of the men snuck out and went to a brothel, and this was the only time that they actually encountered any Chinese women in the whole trip. And so I was very, very careful to use what I knew were their encounters. I didn't make up any scenes that were not true, because in a way, the fact that they were unable to have any clue about what life was like for the real Chinese people is part of the story, is part of the difficulty of what it must have been like to be a woman in China at that time.
Kate, not only are you a prolific novelist, but a writing teacher as well. You run a number of courses across a variety of platforms. I've done a couple of your online courses through the ASA, and you do others through Writing New South Wales, run writing retreats and appear at festivals, among other things. How do you balance all of that with your novel writing?
I tend to like to write in my study at home with all my books and all my beautiful things around me, but I can write anywhere. My first half a dozen novels were written on the kitchen table, and I had to pack it away every night so that we could eat. My first dozen books were written with very small children. So I used to write, I used to breastfeed while I wrote. I would write with one hand and hold my baby with the other one, or my baby would kick around on the floor behind me while I wrote, or I would push them very fast in a pram so they fell asleep, and then I'd write on a park bench. I've written on planes and in hotel rooms. I'll write anywhere, because to not write is my idea of unhappiness. So my other thing is I love to teach, because I just remember myself as a young writer, as a young aspiring author, and having to learn everything the hard way, having to teach myself, having to study and learn on my own. And I'm a great believer in, I suppose, paying it forward. So I do everything I can to help other writers at every stage of their career. I want to help support and celebrate them, and I want to help them learn to be a better writer. All of us are on this journey of discovery. It only helps us all if we take our craft very seriously. So I love to teach. I love to write. I see no reason why I can't do both.
So I read with interest in your bio that your ancestor Charlotte Atkinson published the first children's book ever written in Australia. And connected to that, you've recently been named the 2019 recipient of the Nancy Kessing Fellowship by the State Library of New South Wales for the purpose of delving further into Charlotte Atkinson's life.
Yes. So my great-great-great-great-grandmother was Charlotte Waring Atkinson. She came to Australia from England as a young woman in the 1820s to be a governess to the MacArthur family. But on board the ship, she fell madly in love with a young settler called James Atkinson and married him. And they were very happy. They lived in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales and had 4 children in very quick succession. But then her husband died tragically of typhoid, and she was left a widow with 4 children on this property on the edge of the wilderness. And, you know, she basically had to fight then against prejudice, against violence, against all sorts of obstacles. To support her children, she wrote this book. It's called A Mother's Offering to Her Children by a Lady Long resident in New South Wales. And it was published in 1841. It was the first children's book published in Australia. And with the proceeds from this book, she was able to support her children and feed them and educate them until her son, who'd only been 2 or 3 when his father died, he was able to inherit the property at the age of 21. So she had to look after them and support them for almost 20 years. It's an extraordinary story. my elder sister is a writer as well. Her name is Belinda Morel, and she's a children's writer. And so we've been commissioned by the National Library of Australia to write a biblia memoir of our famous ancestor. By this we mean that we are combining a biography of her, but we're also interweaving it with the stories of our own lives as writers, as mothers who have to write, what it's like to grow up in a literary family. There are quite a few other writers in the Waring and Atkinson bloodline, and it's like a personal memoir of our great grandmother. It will be published in 2021 because that is the 200-year anniversary of the publication of A Mother's Offering to Her Children. And so we're writing the book in order to bring it out as part of the celebrations of her 200th anniversary.
There are a lot of aspiring and emerging writers who listen to this podcast. So I wanted to ask, in your experience as a writer and a teacher, what would you say are the most common mistakes aspiring or emerging writers make?
A few mistakes that I see over and over and over again. The first has got to do with an aspiring author's attitude to their own writing, and the second has got more to do with how they go about it. So the biggest problem that I have is with aspiring authors and their struggles with anxiety and fear. They're afraid to start writing because they're afraid it won't be any good, that they have no talent. They're afraid to start writing because they're afraid of criticism. They're afraid to start writing because, they only want to do it if they're going to be hugely successful. So they're looking to the outside world for validation, for something that should be a natural and intuitive and joyous process. They're so afraid of criticism that they'd rather strangle themselves than actually give it a go. I do my best to give them the courage to try and the faith in themselves and their own stories. One of the things that I say to them is that there is no room for ego in creativity. You are the servant of your story. The story is not your servant. And so you need to put aside your own fear and your own desire. No one else but you can write that story because you are unique and your story will be unique. And so all the times you procrastinate or you feel anxious or you want someone to tell you that you're brilliant, you're actually just feeding this kind of ego-driven writing instead of submitting to the story and just saying, this is my story and I'm going to tell it the best way that I can. Sometimes this padlock on people's creativity lasts all of their lives and they never unlock it. And I believe that thwarted creativity is very dangerous, both for your psychological health and for your physical health. It makes you sick. Birds sing for the joy of it. Writers write for the joy of it. And so that's my most important lesson I can give to anyone. Stop worrying about what other people think. Just do the very best that you can. That has enormous value. Actually sitting down and attempting something so difficult and achieving that difficult thing is worth it. My second piece of advice has got to do with how people go about the actual practice of writing. And this is that it's a thing apart from their own life. They say, I'm going to write a novel. But then they sit down and they start writing, but they've got no idea what they're doing or where they're going. And so the writing is slow and difficult and a little bit overwhelming. And so they stop and say it's too hard. But the story is insistent within them. And so then they give it another go, but it's too hard, and so they give up again. And all of this half-hearted starts and stopping is very, very damaging to the story itself. You never get a chance to breathe. So I have a couple of solutions to this particular problem. One is I teach them to write really freely and to think of their first draft as being a discovery draft. They're allowed to play and experiment and make mistakes. They can write the same scene in 6 different ways and find which one works best. They can try different points of view before they decide on the best one. I allow them to play and experiment. And the other thing that I teach them to do is how to plan. Planning a novel is the most beautiful and joyous experience because it's a way of discovering your story. When you have a strong sense of your story's shape and you know your key turning points, how the story begins and how the story ends, when your characters have been brought to life in your imagination and are speaking with their own voices and acting in their own way, the actual writing process is much stronger. You can write much faster and much more freely and much more joyously, and you're less likely to make terrible, terrible mistakes that kind of slow you down and hamper your progress. Now, a lot of people think that these two things are opposites to each other. The more carefully you plan, the more able you are to play and experiment and keep pushing your story forward because you have a strong sense of what it is that you're actually doing. It's like shining a light down a long, dark tunnel. It doesn't show you the whole way, but it shows you more than a step ahead. And that leads to much better writing.
Wow. So there you have it, listeners. Some excellent advice from a master storyteller. Kate, I can't thank you enough for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today. I absolutely loved chatting with you.
Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure, Claudine.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage, claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.